July 21st, 1919, 9 o'clock at night. U Street Corridor, Northwest Washington District of Columbia. Marcus Thompson stood on his front porch at 7th and U, gripping two things. In his right hand, the Springfield rifle he'd carried through the Argonne forest in France just 8 months earlier. In his left hand, his leather Bible worn from years of Sunday services at the True Reformer Hall down the street. Behind him, his wife Sarah pressed their two children against the doorframe. A 3-year-old boy, a 5-year-old girl. Both too young to understand what was coming, but old enough to feel their mother's trembling hands. The July heat wrapped around everything, like a blanket soaked in gasoline and fear. Marcus could see them now. 400 white men moving up the street like a wave of torches and rage. Sailors in their navy whites. Marines who'd thrown civilian jackets over their uniforms. They carried baseball bats wrapped in barbed wire, iron pipes, pistols shoved into waistbands, and they were singing racist songs as they marched toward black homes, toward black families, toward children sleeping in their beds. This wasn't random. This wasn't spontaneous. The Washington Post had printed the call that very morning. Front page. A literal mobilization order for white servicemen to gather at 9 p.m. for what the paper called a cleanup operation. Every black person in Washington knew what cleanup meant. It meant what had happened Saturday night. What had happened Sunday. White mobs dragging black people off streetcars in broad daylight. Beating black men on the steps of the White House. Yes, Pennsylvania Avenue, 1600, while President Woodrow Wilson sat inside and did absolutely nothing. It meant Randall Neal, 22 years old, a veteran just like Marcus, shot dead by Marines who drove past and opened fire like he was target practice. But Marcus Thompson wasn't running. Neither were the 50 other black men standing at intersections all along U Street that night. Veterans, men who'd seen combat in Europe, men who'd spent the afternoon pooling $14,000 between them. That's $254,000 in today's money. They'd gone to every gun shop, every pawn shop in the city, and bought 500 firearms, rifles, shotguns, pistols, boxes of ammunition. Because the 700-member Metropolitan Police Department had made it crystal clear for 3 straight days. They would not protect Black Washington. Some officers stood by and watched the beatings. Some joined in. The white mob spotted Marcus. They raised their weapons. They started running toward his porch, and Marcus raised his rifle. What happened in the next 60 minutes changed American history. The mob scattered. White men fell wounded in the streets. For one of the only times in 20th century racial violence, white casualties outnumbered black casualties. Armed black defense worked. The terrorists fled. The community survived. And then for 75 years, this story was erased, deleted from textbooks, twisted into something called a race riot, as if race itself committed violence. The heroism buried. The truth hidden, the lesson suppressed, because the lesson was too dangerous. They couldn't let you know that when black people fought back, the lynch mobs ran. Until now. Everything you learned about 1919 was a lie. A carefully constructed lie built by white newspapers and white historians who spent an entire century making sure you never knew what really happened. They called it a race riot. They blamed both sides. They made it sound like chaos, like random violence, like everybody was equally guilty. That's not what happened. What happened was organized white terrorism met organized black military defense. What happened was veterans who'd just fought for democracy in France said, "Not here, not in our city, not to our families." What happened was courage, strategy, precision, victory. And they erased every word of it. By the end of this video, you will know the exact conspiracy between the Washington Post and white military servicemen to orchestrate a massacre in the nation's capital. You will know the names, the tactics, the weapons that Black World War I veterans used to save hundreds of lives. You will know why this story was systematically deleted from American textbooks for 3 entire generations. And you will understand how the 1919 blueprint of white terrorism connects directly to gentrification, police brutality, and the wealth gap destroying Black communities right now today in 2025. This is not ancient history. Your great-grandparents lived this. If your family was in Washington in 1919, they either stood on that porch with Marcus Thompson, or they survived because someone else did. And the reason you never heard about it, that erasure was intentional, deliberate, systematic. They could not allow you to know that armed Black self-defense worked. That when Black communities organized, trained, and fought back, white mobs fled. That lesson was too powerful, too dangerous, too transformative. You're about to reclaim what they stole. Not just the history, not just the truth, but the knowledge of who you really are, what your ancestors really did, and what you're truly capable of when you stop believing their lies and start living in your power. Let's begin. The summer of 1919 was baptized in blood. Between April and October, white mobs attacked Black communities in at least 26 American cities. James Weldon Johnson, Field Secretary of the NAACP, looked at the violence and gave it a name. Red Summer. Red for the blood of Black people spilled in streets from Texas to Nebraska, from Florida to Illinois, from Arkansas to the nation's capital. In Elaine, Arkansas, 237 Black sharecroppers were hunted through cotton fields and slaughtered in a single coordinated massacre. In Chicago, 38 people died, and more than 1,000 Black families watched their homes burn while firefighters stood by and did nothing. White America was killing Black America, and they were doing it with permission, with coordination, with media support, and it was all triggered by one thing: Black prosperity, Black pride, Black power. 385,000 Black men had just returned from World War I. They had worn the uniform of the United States military. They had fought in the trenches of France. They had survived mustard gas machine gun fire artillery barrages. They had faced down the German army and won. And they had been promised that when they came home, things would be different. They had been promised equality. They had been promised respect. They had been promised that America would finally recognize their humanity. Instead, they came home to white America, absolutely terrified of them. Terrified of Black men who knew how to use weapons. Terrified of Black men who had seen Europe, who had been treated with dignity by French civilians, who refused to bow and scrape and step off the sidewalk anymore. Terrified of Black men who looked white America in the eye and said, "We fought for democracy over there. Now we're going to have democracy right here." In February 1919, a Black veteran named Wilbur Little returned to Georgia still wearing his army uniform. White men lynched him, hung him from a tree. The stated reason wearing his uniform past the authorized date. The real reason reminding white Georgia that Black men could be soldiers, could be warriors, could be dangerous. The message was clear. You may have fought in France, but you are still a slave here. You may have earned medals, but you are still less than human here. You may have risked your life for this country, but this country does not belong to you. Get back in your place, bow your head, accept your inferiority, or die. Black veterans heard that message, and they rejected it. Across America, Black communities that had always relied on accommodation, on negotiation, on hoping white people would eventually do the right thing, those communities started shifting, started organizing, started training, started arming, The generation that had survived slavery was dying off. The generation that had fought in Europe was taking over, and this generation had a different philosophy. A philosophy captured perfectly in a poem that spread through Black America like wildfire in the summer of 1919. Claude McKay wrote it, "If we must die." Listen to these words. If we must die, let it not be like hogs hunted and penned in an inglorious spot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Like men, we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. Dying, but fighting back. That became the anthem of 1919. That became the strategy. That became the reality in Washington, in Chicago, in dozens of other places where white mobs expected easy victims and found warriors instead. Washington District of Columbia was ground zero. The nation's capital had something that terrified white America, a thriving black middle class. U Street, the heart of Black Washington, was called Black Broadway. It was a 7-block stretch of black excellence that made white Washington furious just by existing. Black-owned banks financing black businesses. Black-owned hotels, like the Whitelaw, opened in 1919 by entrepreneur John Whitelaw, specifically for black travelers barred from white establishments. Black-owned theaters where Duke Ellington would soon play, where Pearl Bailey would sing, where black culture was created and celebrated. Howard University, producing black doctors, black lawyers, black engineers, black architects. 96% of all black lawyers trained at Howard. 50% of all black physicians graduated from Howard. This was not supposed to happen. Black wealth, black education, black power. In the shadow of the White House. In the capital of a nation built on the idea that black people were inferior. White Washington seethed. And then the match was lit. July 19, 1919, Saturday night. A white woman named Elsie Stefnick walked into a police station and reported that a black man had assaulted her. She gave a name, Charles Rawls. It was a lie, or at best such an exaggeration, that it bore no resemblance to reality. But truth did not matter. Truth never mattered when white women accused black men. The accusation was enough. The rumor spread through the bars where white sailors were drinking, through the barracks where white Marines were stationed, through the streets where white civilians were already angry about black people who refused to know their place. By evening, hundreds of white men had formed a mob. These were not random thugs. These were active-duty United States military personnel, sailors stationed at the Washington Navy Yard, Marines fresh from combat, soldiers who still wore the uniform. They flooded southwest Washington, hunting for Charles Rawls. But they were not looking for one man. They were looking for any black person they could find. Man, woman, child, elderly. It did not matter. They dragged black people off streetcars, pulled them into alleys, beat them with pipes and bats, left them bleeding in the gutters, and the police watched. 700 officers in the Metropolitan Police Department. They stood on street corners and watched white servicemen commit terrorism. Some officers were openly sympathetic. Some handed the mob members their own nightsticks. Some joined in the beatings. Sunday, July 20th. The violence escalated. White mobs beat black people at Center Market on 7th Street in the middle of the commercial district in broad daylight. They beat black people on Pennsylvania Avenue. Yes, in front of the White House. In front of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, where President Woodrow Wilson, the man who had segregated federal agencies, the man who had screened Birth of a Nation in the White House, the man who had praised the Ku Klux Klan, sat and did absolutely nothing. A young black man named Randall Neal, 22 years old, a veteran who had served his country honorably, was walking home when Marines drove by in a car. They opened fire. Randall Neal fell dead in the street. Remember that name. Randall Neal, 22, a veteran, murdered by the very military he had served alongside, his crime being black, being visible, being alive. Black Washington begged for protection. Community leaders went to city officials. They went to the police chief. They went to federal authorities. The answer was silence, excuses, delays. The message was clear. You are on your own. Protect yourselves or die. And then Monday morning, July 21st, the Washington Post published the most incendiary, the most criminal, the most evil headline of the entire era. Front page. A story calling for all available servicemen to mobilize at 9 p.m. for a cleanup operation. The article promised that Monday night would make the events of the last 2 evenings pale into insignificance. Read that again. The Washington Post, a major American newspaper, printed a call for white servicemen to gather for the specific purpose of attacking black neighborhoods. This was not reporting. This was organizing a lynching. This was coordinating a massacre. This was terrorism with a byline. Black Washington read that headline Monday morning, and every black person who read it knew exactly what was coming. 9 p.m. white servicemen would gather, and then they would march into black neighborhoods with the intent to kill. Black families had a choice: run, hide, or fight. For generations, the advice had always been the same: run, hide, accommodate. Do not resist, because resistance means death. But this generation, the generation of veterans, the generation that had faced German machine guns, made a different choice. Monday, July 21st, daytime, while white mobs prepared for the 9 p.m. mobilization. Black Washingtonians took action. They went door to door through U Street, through Shaw, through every black neighborhood, pooling money. Every family gave what they could: dollars from men who worked as porters, coins from women who cleaned white people's houses, bills from the few black professionals, the teachers and ministers. $14,000. In 1919, that was a fortune. Today, that is $254,000. They collected it in a matter of hours, and then they went shopping. Every gun shop in Washington, every pawn shop, every place that sold firearms. Black men walked in cash in hand and bought everything: pistols, rifles, shotguns, boxes of ammunition, hunting knives, anything that could be used for defense. The white shop owners sold to them eagerly, not understanding what was happening, just seeing dollar signs. 500 firearms sold in a single afternoon. When police got wind of the scale of the arming and tried to shut down the legal gun sales, black residents turned to the black market. They bought from each other. They borrowed from friends who had served and brought weapons home. They improvised making clubs and improvised weapons. Nothing was going to stop them. If white Washington wanted war, black Washington would give them war. But this was not panic. This was not chaos. These were organized veterans, men who had served in the 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, one of the most decorated black units in World War I. Men from the 93rd Division who had fought under French command because the American military was too racist to let black soldiers fight alongside white soldiers. These were men who knew tactics, who understood defensive positions, who knew how to establish fields of fire, how to coordinate, how to cover each other. They were not a mob. They were a militia. As darkness fell on Monday, July 21st, they gathered. 7th and U Street, the heart of Black Broadway. This was the intersection they chose. Wide sightlines, buildings on all sides that could be used for cover, multiple escape routes. This was their Thermopylae, their Alamo, their line in the sand. 50 black men, most of them veterans, all of them armed, standing on porches, in doorways, behind windows, waiting. They sent the women and children to interior rooms away from windows. They positioned themselves. They loaded their weapons, and they waited for the mob. The white mob assembled exactly as the Washington Post had instructed. Knights of Columbus Recreation Center on Pennsylvania Avenue. 400 men, sailors in uniform, Marines, soldiers, civilians who wanted to join the fun. They armed themselves with bats, pipes, pistols. They organized into groups, and they moved north toward U Street. They expected what they had gotten Saturday and Sunday. Terrified black people running, easy targets, victims who would beg and plead, a slaughter. They got war instead. The mob reached U Street. They spotted the first black home, Marcus Thompson's house at 7th and U. They started running toward the porch, weapons raised, screaming threats. Marcus Thompson raised his Springfield rifle, the rifle he had carried in France, the rifle he had used to kill German soldiers, the rifle he now pointed at American terrorists. And he fired. The crack of the rifle shot echoed down U Street like a starting gun. And then 50 more guns opened fire. Pistols, shotguns, rifles. A coordinated volley of defensive fire from men who knew how to shoot, who had trained, who were not aiming wild, but aiming center mass like they had been taught. White men in the mob fell. Sailors stumbled backward, bleeding. Marines who had survived combat in France found themselves pinned down, taking fire from elevated positions, from windows, from rooftops. The mob scattered. Some tried to charge the houses. More gunfire drove them back. Some tried to flank around. Black defenders had positioned themselves to cover those approaches. This was not random shooting. This was military tactics applied to urban defense. A group of white men tried to break into Charles Rolls' home. Remember Charles Rolls, the man who had been falsely accused, the man whose name had started this entire nightmare. The mob wanted to lynch him, drag him into the street and hang him. They broke windows. They tried to kick in the door, and Rolls' neighbors opened fire. A fusillade, that is what the newspapers called it later. A fusillade of shots from multiple black defenders. White men fell wounded. The mob fled. Charles Rolls and his wife escaped. Out the back, ran to a neighbor's house, hid in a basement. The mob tried to pursue. More gunfire. The mob gave up. All along U Street from 7th to 14th, the same scene repeated. White mob attacks. Black defenders fire back. White casualties. Mob retreats. The Washington Post itself, reluctantly, bitterly, had to report what happened. The paper wrote in the Negro district along U Street, from 7th to 14th Streets, the Negroes began early in the evening to take vengeance for the assaults on their race. Vengeance. That is how they framed self-defense. That is how they described black people defending their children. But read between the propaganda, read what they admitted. The white mob was being driven back. The attack was failing. For the first time, organized armed black resistance was defeating white terrorism. Tuesday, July 22nd, the violence continued, but the dynamic had shifted. White mobs tried again to enter black neighborhoods. They faced the same coordinated resistance. Black residents set up armed patrols. They walked the streets in groups, openly carrying weapons, daring the mobs to try again. They were doing the job the police refused to do, protecting their community. White casualties mounted. A white police officer, Detective Sergeant Harry Wilson, was shot and killed. Caught in crossfire, or perhaps targeted for his complicity. The white newspapers screamed about Negro violence, but the casualty numbers told the truth. 10 white people dead, 5 black people dead. In 20th century racial violence, that ratio was unheard of. Normally, black casualties outnumbered white casualties 10 to 1, 20 to 1, 100 to 1. But not in Washington. Not when black people were armed, organized, and determined. Finally, after 4 days of terrorism, after 4 days of the president doing nothing, Woodrow Wilson ordered 2,000 federal troops into the city. Soldiers with bayonets, machine gun units, armored cars. The troops occupied Washington like it was a foreign city. But historians who have studied this agree on one thing. It was not the troops that ended the violence. It was a rainstorm Tuesday night that scattered both sides. It was exhaustion, and it was the undeniable fact that the white mob had met resistance they never anticipated and could not overcome. The lynch mob, for one of the only times in American history, had been defeated. When the smoke cleared, official reports listed 15 dead, 10 white, including 2 police officers, 5 black. But those numbers are lies. Black community leaders estimated the true death toll was closer to 30, maybe more. Some bodies were never found. Some families were too afraid to report their dead. Some victims were quietly buried without official record. Dozens more were hospitalized with serious injuries, beaten, shot, stabbed. The black community along U Street was traumatized, grieving burying their dead. But they were unbroken. They had stood. They had fought. They had survived. And here is the most important statistic, the number they do not want you to know. This was one of the only times in 20th century racial violence where white casualties outnumbered black casualties. Read that again. Hear it. Understand it. When black people were armed, when black people were organized, when black people were determined, the result was different. The terrorists fled. The lynch mob scattered. The community survived. Armed black defense worked. But the white establishment could not allow that narrative to stand. When the last shots faded and the last bodies were counted, something else started. The second battle. The battle over the story. Within days, white newspapers in Washington began rewriting what had happened. They took 4 nights of white mob terror, sparked by their own headlines, and turned it into a neat little phrase. Race riot. They blurred who started it. They blurred who organized it. They blurred who defended whom. They buried the coal that had gone out on Monday morning. They blamed both sides. They made black self-defense sound like black aggression. They took a moment of black courage and turned it into a crime. And that is where the pattern starts to show itself. Because Washington was not unique. What happened there was part of a national strategy, a blueprint. Washington was one flashpoint in a much larger war against black progress. To really understand how serious this was, how calculated it was, you have to zoom out. You have to leave U Street for a few minutes and travel with me. First to Chicago, then to a little church in Elaine, Arkansas, then to Greenwood District in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And as you listen, do not just hear dates and names. Listen for the pattern. Listen for what always happens when black people build something powerful. Just 1 week after Washington violence erupted in Chicago, July 27, 1919, it started with water. Lake Michigan, a hot summer Sunday. A group of black teenagers went swimming at a segregated beach. There was no official line in the water, no sign, no rope, just an invisible boundary that white residents had decided existed. One of those boys, 17-year-old Eugene Williams, drifted past that invisible line on a raft. White men on the shore started throwing rocks at him, stone after stone. Eugene lost his grip. He slipped under the water and did not come back up. He drowned while people watched. Black witnesses begged a white police officer on the scene to arrest the man who had thrown the rocks. The officer refused. He did nothing. Sound familiar? Black anger boiled over. Fights broke out on the beach. The fight spread into the city. White mobs formed. They went into black neighborhoods on the south side. They burned houses. They beat anyone they could catch. But like Washington, Chicago had black veterans who were not going to die quietly. By the end of that week, 38 people were dead. 23 black, 15 white, 537 injured. More than 1,000 black families left homeless. Entire blocks of black homes reduced to ash. And again, look at the numbers. This was not a simple one-way slaughter. Black Chicago fought back. Veterans from the 8th Illinois Infantrymen who had served in France organized patrols. They set up defensive lines. They returned fire when mobs tried to invade their streets. The Illinois National Guard eventually rolled in with thousands of soldiers to restore order. But they did not roll in when black people were being attacked. They rolled in when black people started winning fights. Chicago was not an accident. It was part of the same wave. A black community that had created a strong working and middle class. A city where black newspapers like the Chicago Defender had built political power. And then suddenly, a triggering incident, a death, a refusal of police to do their duty, white mobs pouring into black neighborhoods, and then a narrative after the fact that called it a race riot and blamed both sides. Sound familiar? Hold that thought, because what happened next in Arkansas takes the pattern to an even darker level. September 30th, 1919, Elaine, Arkansas. This was not a city. This was Delta farmland, cotton country. Black sharecroppers had worked that land for generations, tied to white landowners by crooked contracts they could never escape. The system was simple. Black families did the work. White landowners kept the profit. At the end of every harvest, the landowner did the math and told the sharecropper, "You still owe me." No receipts, no transparency, just theft wrapped in paperwork. In 1919, black sharecroppers in Elaine decided they had had enough. They formed a union, the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America. They wanted fair pay. They wanted honest accounting. They wanted to hire lawyers to challenge the cheating. On the night of September 30th, about 100 black men and women met at Hoop Spur Church near Elaine to talk strategy. Some of the men stood guard outside armed because everyone knew what could happen when black people gathered to talk about rights. White men showed up, a deputy sheriff and a railroad security officer. Shots were fired. To this day, no one can say with certainty who fired first. What we do know is that both white men ended up wounded and one later died. White Arkansas exploded. Within hours, white posses formed across Phillips County. They called in federal troops. They framed it as a Negro uprising, as an insurrection. Then they launched what one historian called a hunter's massacre. For 2 days, white posses and soldiers rode through the fields and along the roads, shooting black people on sight. Men, women, children. Some estimate that 237 black people were killed around Elaine. Some bodies were left in the fields. Others were thrown into the Mississippi River. There were no proper death records, no long list of names. Just a black community wiped out because they dared to demand fair pay for their labor. And when it was over, who went on trial? Not the white killers, black survivors. 122 black men were arrested. 12 were quickly convicted in sham trials and sentenced to death. The NAACP fought for years to get those convictions overturned. The Supreme Court eventually stepped in and threw out the worst of them. But the damage was done. The message was sent. Organize for economic justice, and we will call you rebels. We will call you criminals. We will slaughter you and then drag you into court. Once again, after the smoke cleared, the story got rewritten. White newspapers ran headlines about Negro insurrection. They painted the massacre as a justified response to black violence. The actual root cause, black workers asking to see the books, disappeared. The hundreds of black dead vanished in official numbers. School children in Arkansas grew up with no idea that one of the worst racial massacres in American history had happened in their own state. Now put Washington, Chicago, Elaine side by side in your mind. A black community building power, a triggering incident, police standing down or joining in, white mobs or white posses attacking, black veterans fighting back where they can. Official numbers that always undercount black deaths, headlines that flip the blame, textbooks that smooth it over as racial unrest. You see the pattern yet? You should. But we are not done. 2 years later, that same pattern shows up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Only this time, the scale of black success and the scale of white violence both reach a new level. Greenwood District, Tulsa, Black Wall Street. On the eve of May 31st, 1921, this neighborhood was the pride of Black America. 35 city blocks of Black-owned wealth, over 1,000 Black homes, more than 300 Black-owned businesses, 2 newspapers, a public library, doctors' offices, law firms, grocery stores, restaurants, a 14-room luxury hotel, several churches. People dressed well, drove nice cars, sent their children to college. Economists today estimate that in modern dollars, the property in Greenwood was worth tens of millions. Some say more than 30 million. Some families were millionaires at a time when that was unheard of for Black Americans. And just like U Street in Washington, just like the south side of Chicago, Greenwood sat too close to white power. Too visible, too successful. White Tulsa watched Black Wall Street and seethed. Black people owning land, Black people running banks, Black people making money without white oversight. That was dangerous to the system. On May 30th, 1921, a young Black shoeshiner named Dick Rowland entered an elevator in the Drexel Building in downtown Tulsa. A white elevator operator named Sarah Page was in the car. Something happened. Maybe the elevator jerked and he stumbled. Maybe there was a misunderstanding. What we know is that Sarah screamed. Someone outside heard the scream and saw Rowland running away. The next day, white newspapers published a story accusing him of assault. One headline screamed about an attempted attack. No trial, no evidence. Just an accusation. Within hours, a lynch mob formed. They surrounded the courthouse where Dick Rowland was being held. Inside the Black community, men remembered what had happened in other towns when mobs broke through jail doors. They decided this time would be different. A group of about 75 Black men, many of them veterans, armed themselves and went to the courthouse to offer their services to the sheriff. They said, "We are here to help guard the prisoner and prevent a lynching." The sheriff refused their help. Tensions rose. Words were exchanged between a white man in the crowd and a Black veteran. A gun went off. No one knows who fired the first shot. Within moments, all hell broke loose. Shots rang out. The smaller group of Black defenders fought their way back to Greenwood. White Tulsans grabbed their guns. The next day, May 31st into June 1st, a white mob of thousands invaded Greenwood. Not just poor whites, businessmen, city officials, police, National Guard members. They looted homes. They set businesses on fire. They shot men in the street. They set up machine guns. And then something even more shocking. Airplanes appeared overhead. White pilots flew private planes. They dropped incendiary devices onto Black homes and buildings. They strafed the streets. Greenwood was bombed from the air. This was the first aerial bombing of an American city. By the time it ended, 35 blocks lay in ruins. Official counts said 36 people were killed. Survivors and later investigations say the number was likely over 300. 10,000 Black residents were left homeless. 1,256 homes burned. hundreds of businesses destroyed. $2 million in 1921, money over $30 million today, wiped out in 48 hours. And then came the second battle. Just like Washington, just like Chicago, just like Elaine, the battle over the story. Insurance companies refused to pay claims, saying that policies did not cover riot damage. City officials changed fire codes and zoning laws, making it nearly impossible for Black families to rebuild in the same way. Records of property ownership disappeared. Police and city archives conveniently misplaced key files. White Tulsa called it a Negro uprising. They blamed Black veterans for daring to show up at the courthouse armed. They painted the massacre as a necessary response. For 75 years, Tulsa schools did not teach about Black Wall Street or the massacre that destroyed it. Oklahoma textbooks barely mentioned it, if at all. White residents did not talk about it. Black survivors were warned to stay quiet. Mass graves lay hidden. Whole generations grew up Black and white, with no idea that one of the wealthiest Black communities in the country had been burned off the map by their own neighbors, aided by the city government, and protected by silence. Now step back. Washington, Chicago, Elaine, Tulsa, Wilmington years earlier, Rosewood a few years later, Ocoee in Florida, East St. Louis, Springfield. The names change, the dates shift, the pattern does not. Every time Black people built wealth, it got targeted. Every time Black communities reached a certain level of prosperity, white institutions and white mobs moved to destroy it. Sometimes they used rumors of assaults. Sometimes they used lawsuits. Sometimes they used city planning or zoning. But the result was always the same. Black wealth burned. Black bodies buried. Black survivors blamed. And then over time, Black memory erased. Do you see the pattern now? This is not random. This is not just people who got angry. This is not the story of two sides who just could not get along. This is economic warfare. This is political warfare. This is a system that has spent a century and more making sure Black people stay exactly where that system wants them. Not owning, not controlling, not inheriting, not remembering. And this is where we need to pause for a moment. Because if you are feeling your chest tight right now, if your jaws clenched, if you are thinking about your grandparents, about how hard they worked and how little they had to show for it, that feeling is not an accident. It is truth waking up inside you. It is your spirit recognizing a pattern it has lived under without having words for it. Let that sit for a second. Then we are going to peel back one more layer. Because seeing the pattern is powerful, but seeing how they covered it up, how they erased it on purpose, that is what really shatters the lie. Before we go there though, this is where you come in. If this truth has hit you even a little, if any part of you is saying, I knew something was wrong, but I did not know it was this deep pause, and do this right now. Drop the word truth in the comments, not for the algorithm, for yourself, as a declaration. I see it now. I am not asleep anymore. If you are tired of the lies in the history books, tired of being told it was just unrest, tired of both sides' language when you know who suffered and who benefited, hit that like button. Not to worship a channel, to send a signal that you are done accepting the official story. And share this. Share it with someone in your family who still thinks they just did not work hard enough. Share it with someone who believes their poverty is a personal failure instead of the result of organized theft. Share it with someone who has never heard the names U Street, Elaine, Greenwood. We are not just scrolling tonight. We are doing memory work. We are digging up what they buried. Do not keep that to yourself, because now we are going into the part they worked the hardest to hide. How they covered their tracks, how they used fire law schools and media to wipe out the evidence. And what you are about to hear will make everything you learned in school feel like a scripted performance. What comes next proves they knew exactly what they were doing. They did not just kill people, they tried to kill the records. After every massacre, there was a second wave. In Tulsa City, officials and business leaders met right after the destruction and talked openly about how to use the ruins of Greenwood for their own benefit. They discussed new fire codes that would require expensive materials most black survivors could not afford. They talked about rezoning the land from residential to industrial. They were not just thinking about public safety. They were thinking about how to make sure black families never stood on their own land again. And quietly, property deeds went missing. Files disappeared. Without paperwork, families could not prove what they had owned. In Rosewood, Florida, in 1923, white mobs did not just kill black residents. They bulldozed the whole town. Houses, churches, stores, all of it flattened. Today, it is just trees and road. No marker telling you what stood there. Unless someone tells you, you drive by and never know an entire black community once lived and prospered in that place. That is not just violence. That is erasure. In Elaine, bodies were dumped in the river or buried in mass graves without markers. No names carved in stone. No official count. Later generations could look back and see a tiny number on paper and say, maybe it was not that bad. Maybe people exaggerated. That is what missing records are for. Not just laziness, protection. And in Washington, look at what happened to the names of the black defenders. We know from white newspapers that black men fought back. We know from scattered reports that veterans organized, that a fusillade of shots drove off a mob at Charles Roll's home, that gunfire along U Street turned the streets into a battlefield. But where are the names? Where is the list of 50 veterans who stood at 7th and U? Where is Marcus Thompson in the official archives? You will not find him, because no one in power wanted those names preserved. No one wanted black children growing up hearing about their great-grandfather who stood with a rifle and defended his block. Physical destruction was step one. Take the land, take the buildings, take the paper trails, remove every physical sign that black people had built something powerful. If there is no deed, how do you sue? If there is no building, what do you show your grandchildren? If there is no grave marker, who do you mourn on anniversaries? The goal was simple. If there is no evidence, there is no crime. If there is no trace, there is nothing to remember. But they did not stop at flames and lost files. They turned to the law. They weaponized policy. After Tulsa, when black families filed insurance claims for burned homes and businesses, insurance companies denied almost everyone. The reason? The fine print in many policies excluded damage caused by riot or civil commotion. So city officials, newspapers, and business interests all had an incentive to call what happened a riot instead of a massacre. Riot meant no payout. Massacre might have meant liability. So the word riot became a shield. Money stayed in white hands. Black families got nothing. Think about that. You paid your premiums. You did everything right. You protected your home. Then your government could not or would not protect you from a mob. The mob burned your home to the ground. And then the company you trusted told you, sorry, this type of destruction is not covered. That is not just misfortune. That is coordinated theft. That is wealth transfer under color of law. Cities passed ordinances that locked in the damage. In Tulsa, new fire codes required brick and other materials that were far more expensive than what people had used before. On top of that, zoning changes reclassified parts of Greenwood for industrial use. If an area is zoned industrial, you cannot just rebuild your home there. You cannot open a small shop. You cannot recreate your community. On paper, it looks like neutral planning, In practice, it is a second wave of dispossession. Similar patterns showed up across the country. In city after city, black neighborhoods were labeled blighted or slums decades later, making them prime targets for highways and so-called urban renewal. Whole communities were razed in the 1950s and 60s, often in the exact same places that had been attacked in earlier decades. The language had changed. Instead of mobs, it was planners. Instead of torches, it was bulldozers. Instead of a lynch mob, it was a city council vote. But the result? Black families displaced, land value transferred elsewhere. The law also came down on black self-defense. In the aftermath of Red Summer, states passed laws restricting gun ownership in ways that hit black communities hardest. Officials targeted the very weapons black veterans had used to defend their neighborhoods. Carrying a rifle in defense of your home in 1919 might have kept your family alive. Carry that same rifle under new laws, and you risked prison. Meanwhile, white militias and groups like the Ku Klux Klan operated with impunity, often with local law enforcement looking the other way. The message was clear. The system will not punish those who terrorize you, but it will punish you if you stand up for yourself. All of this would have been bad enough, but they still were not finished. They had one more battleground to conquer: the minds of your children and grandchildren, the classroom, the textbook, the curriculum. For decades, whole chapters of this story were simply absent from school books. In Oklahoma, public school students learned nothing about Tulsa Black Wall Street for most of the 20th century. No lessons about 35 blocks, burned about 1,256 homes, destroyed about 300 lives lost. No mention of airplanes dropping fire on American citizens. You could grow up in Tulsa Graduate High School with honors and never once hear the word Greenwood. If you asked your elders, many were too traumatized or too afraid to talk. Silence became survival. When textbooks did mention Red Summer or these events, they did it in the most sterile way possible. One paragraph, phrases like racial unrest, racial tensions, clashes between blacks and whites. That kind of language does two things. It hides intentions, and it spreads blame evenly. Unrest sounds like something that just happens. Tensions sound like weather. Clashes between blacks and whites make it seem like both sides did something wrong, when in reality, one side attacked and the other side defended. Notice what words are missing: terrorism, massacre, lynching, organized campaigns. Those words force you to name perpetrators. They force you to see victims. They force you to confront systems. So they are replaced with softer, vaguer terms. The violence becomes abstract. The suffering becomes just another footnote. And the most important erasure inside the erasure: the deletion of black armed resistance. In textbook after textbook, you will not see the stories of black veterans on U Street. You will not read that in Washington and Chicago, black communities fought back so effectively that white casualties were unusually high. You will not hear that in some cities, white mobs were forced to retreat. Because that truth is dangerous in a different way. It shows that the system can be resisted. It shows that the script can be flipped. It shows that you come from people who refuse to die quietly. If all you learn in school is that your ancestors were victims, if the only images you see are of chains and hoses and dogs, you internalize a story of helplessness, a story where power is always on the other side. But if you learn that in 1919, black men in Washington turned their neighborhood into a fortress and sent a lynch mob running, if you learn that in Chicago, black veterans defended their blocks, if you learn that resistance has always been part of the story, something different wakes up in you, a different identity, a different posture. That is why they cut those parts out. And then there is media, newspapers, radio, later television. In Washington, the same paper that helped light the fuse spent the next days and years pretending it had no role. Remember that Monday morning call to arms, the cleanup operation article that told white servicemen where and when to gather? That little detail faded quickly from their own narrative. What remained in public memory was the idea that Negroes started shooting, that black people were the problem. The inciting headline, the openly reckless language, got buried. White newspapers across the country followed similar scripts. In Elaine, they wrote about a Negro uprising instead of black union members meeting in a church. In Tulsa, some coverage suggested that black people brought the destruction on themselves by going to the courthouse with guns. Black victims became the aggressors. White aggressors became defenders of order. Once those stories were printed, they served as sources for early historians. They formed the backbone of what teachers and students thought was objective history. Meanwhile, black newspapers like the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Baltimore Afro-American, and magazines like The Crisis told very different stories. They named names. They printed casualty lists. They described the terror in detail. They honored black resistance. They asked hard questions, but their reach was limited. They did not sit on every white coffee table. They did not get preserved in every university archive. Many of those papers were not digitized until recently. For decades, if a researcher wanted an easy narrative, they went to the big white papers. That shaped what went into encyclopedias and school curricula. The result: by the time you were born, most of this was hidden in plain sight. Locked in out of print books, scattered across microfilm reels, sitting in boxes in church basements. Your grandmother might have whispered pieces of it. Your grandfather might have referred to the Red Summer or the riots. But without the full picture, it felt like fragments. Without the receipts, people could dismiss those memories as exaggeration. This is why when you hear these stories in full as an adult, it feels like a cognitive earthquake. You realize just how much has been kept from you. You realize that history class was not just incomplete. It was curated. It was edited to protect certain institutions and to keep you from seeing the scale of organized theft and resistance. And that brings us to right now. Because everything we have talked about so far is not just about the past. It is the blueprint for what you see around you today, in your neighborhood, in your bank account, in the nightly news. So here is where we are. We have walked through Washington. We have stood on U Street and watched black veterans defend their homes. We have gone to Chicago and seen bodies in Lake Michigan and homes burned on the South Side. We have sat in a church in Elaine and watched a union meeting turn into a massacre. We have walked through Greenwood before and after the flames. We have watched officials hide deeds, pass laws, rewrite school books, and twist headlines. We have seen the pattern: build, attack, blame, erase. In the next part of this journey, we are going to connect every one of those moves to what you live with right now. The wealth gap that has you working twice as hard for a fraction of the results. The neighborhoods where your family rents instead of owns. The constant fear in black communities when police sirens wail. The debates about reparations that some people still pretend are about charity instead of debt. We are going to talk about numbers, about how much was stolen, about what it would look like to repair. We are going to talk about identity, about how you see yourself when you know the full story. And we are going to talk about why you sitting here watching this video right now are part of something bigger than algorithms and recommendations. You have made it this far. Do not stop now. The next truths we are about to uncover will not just change how you see American history. They will change how you see your own life story.